Next, we'll have Guillaume Montard, who is a founder and CEO at Bureau. Bureau is a data security risk assessment for cloud native application. So hi, Guillaume, how are you?
Hi, Jules. Well, very good, thank you. And I really appreciated the previous presentation. And I think my presentation is going to be a good follow-up on some of the questions actually that have been asked. And well, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I think it's a nice lineup that you put together in the right order.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. So you're going to speak about data privacy at the era of cloud native app. So the idea is to see how to address the difficulties for privacy teams to follow the engineering change and how to reduce the risk for non-compliance fine and bad reputations when you have bad privacy practices. So the mic is yours. I'll let you speak. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jules. So yeah, it's all about the risk assessment at the end of the day, and I think I can fully agree with Jan on that one. Another way to present that talk is like, how do you deal with data privacy when you're building product, when you're having engineers? That's another way to put it that is simpler. So if you're like working in a tech company, if you're working in a startup, if you have like developers, dozens and hundreds of developers, I think that talk is going to be interesting for you. But before jumping in, I just want to go back to 3 key concepts so we can all agree on those first. I think it's important. Data privacy first. So what is data privacy? I think you all know, you all have a pretty good understanding, but at the end, it's just the right of the individual to have control over their personal data. It's all about the law, basically. It's the law requirements. It's all about the documentation that you have to build on top of it. So it's tightly coupled with GDPR and all those different privacy laws. You've got also data security. Data security, it's about protecting those data from attacks. Like you can think about data breach or data leaks. So obviously data privacy and data security, they're linked together, but they're not entirely the same thing at all, though they have like a very strong connection. And privacy engineering, which is the subject of that conference. Well, that's all the methodology, all the tools, everything that we can integrate as privacy principle into how we build product. That's kind of the technical side of the privacy profession. From what we've seen in the market, we see most of the time those those skills that are embedded inside the security team and not the privacy team, because privacy and the security team are obviously tightly coupled and discussing together, though it's more about engineering and about implementation, and usually it falls back to the security team. So again, you see privacy and security being potentially the two sides of the same coin. When we talk about privacy, obviously we talk about GDPR, not only, and I don't want to go into all the principles, but just you keep those in mind. Those are the 7 principles that are going obviously to be the foundation of everything we have to do regarding data privacy. All of those have different impacts. For example, if you take the lawful and fairness and transparency, usually it's impact heavily your privacy policy. If you take the data minimization, it's going to be about access control. If you think about storage limitation, it's your retention policy. If you think about your accountability, it's your ability to prove to auditors. So it's going to have an impact about your ability to do a ROPA, a record of processing activity, where you've got that big document that tells everything you're doing, every type of personal data you're having, why, how, etc. So that's all kind of the baseline of the documentation, the process that we're going to have to take care of. I think it's important to keep in mind that data privacy is paramount today. And I insist on the today, because sometimes we feel like, yeah, it's for later. And I think the previous question that we had about, I'm a small startup, should I take care of it now, or should I have like a certain level of maturity? The reality is that we're all subject to those to data privacy and to those laws, most of us. And it's paramount today because it's very important for your business. Obviously, the first one is because, well, your privacy laws, they are everywhere. Europe, obviously, but the US, Brazil, China, India, you name it. They are everywhere. They're all evolving. So if you're building software and if you're building products, generally speaking, your customers are going to be in one of those locations or multiple of those locations. So you have to take care of it. You don't really have a choice. If you look at Gartner, they say that 65% of the world population by 2023, so like in 18 months, will be subject to a regulation for the personal data. So this is today. If you wait, the more difficult it's going to be. But essentially, if you wait, well, you're going to impact your business, because being able to prove and to be at the forefront of data privacy is crucial for a business today for two reasons. One, which is like more defensive, which is obviously the fine aspect. So it's compliant, it's a regulation, so you have to comply. If you don't comply, you get fined. So there are a lot of examples about that. I think if you did follow this year, $125 million. Amazon is under a fight for $800 million, so it's not small fines, obviously. They're fighting them, but again, it's here. And usually we think it's only for big tech, but the reality is it's absolutely not the case. You have like dozens, hundreds of fine, way smaller fine, in hundreds of thousands, in a few millions euro every day, almost. But you don't hear about them, obviously, because, well, they don't get the press and the attention that the big tech is getting. But it's really for everyone here. So that's that side where it's more like the defensive aspect. But the offensive aspect is obviously transforming that as a competitive advantage and being better than your competitors, basically. I think we all have in mind Apple as a good example of putting privacy at the forefront of their marketing efforts, and trying to market that against Google, for instance, or other competitors. But you see also dozens of smaller companies and startups that see privacy as a competitive advantage. I have like one simple example. Maybe you know that company called Plausible. It's an analytic company, competitor of Google Analytics in a way, but they're focused fully on privacy. This is what we're using at Bearer. This is actually pretty good, but their whole purpose is actually to provide a web analytics platform that is privacy first, and that's their competitive advantage here. And at the end of the day, do that just because you want to win deals and because you want to win more deals than your competitor, and potentially that you don't want to lose deals, because we see more and more, especially in Europe, because GDPR is strong, but we see more and more software vendors actually losing deals over European companies because, well, they don't do everything that those companies want them to do, and they are not confident to give them their data, and it's really part of the purchasing process nowadays, and it's becoming very difficult for some companies to actually, well, prove that they're doing the right things and bypass the purchase discussions on those specific work. But at the same time, engineering organizations, they are becoming super complex. And I think it's very important to understand that as we're engineers, like we have more developers and we're hiring more developers than ever, committing code every day, new features every day. We're working at there with companies that have like hundreds of engineers. So you can imagine the number of project, of product, of features, of line of codes that they build every day. So it's difficult to keep track of that. And at the same time, we completely changed the way we architecture product these days. We use heavily microservices architecture, especially in large company, which is great, but at some point doesn't really help keep track of where are things and how we do things. And at the same time, we increasingly use third-party services thanks to the API economy. I think this conference overall, the API conference is like a good example. It's great to build faster again, but the difficulty that, well, you're going to send data to multiple providers. You don't exactly know which data, you don't know where they are. Your engineering, your product team might actually switch or change services or actually embed a new one without really knowing. So it increases that complexity over an architecture that is very fragmented at the end of the day, especially if you're getting quite big in terms of product engineering team. So at the end, privacy teams, I think they can keep up. That's what the market tells us when we discuss with all those teams. It's very, very difficult because they have to do, the first thing for them is map their personal data flow, so understand what personal data they have. So yes, we talk about personal data because that's GDPR language. They have to understand what they have, where it is in that complex architecture. They need to document all the information regarding privacy and security together. They need to identify the privacy risk because it's a risk assessment at the end of the day. What are the gaps? And they need to do that every day, all the time. So when you've got engineers building code, building new features, evolving features every day, keeping track of that is the biggest difficulty. We have one really good example with a customer we're working with. They have like 500 engineers, roughly. They built 5,000 applications across the years. They hired a DPO 2 years ago with the job, well, to do the GDPR job and essentially to do two things: build a comprehensive ROPA, record of posting activity, and implement privacy by design directly in the software development lifecycle. So over 2 years, what they've done at the end of the day is that they spent 80 hours interviewing product engineering team to understand who is doing what, which data do we have, how are the systems built. And they've started to implement a DPIA process at the specification level. So when you want to build a new feature, you build up spec and you ask your product team to provide a DPIA at the same time. So asking them to change their habits, asking them to change their flow. Obviously, they don't just have 1 or 2 product teams, they have like dozens of product teams. The results are not looking great 2 years after. The reality is that in 2 years, they've been able to actually assess only 20% of the scope, of the initial scope, with all that work and all that investment. And the DPIA they started to embed, well, it's not followed correctly by the team. And essentially, there is a big gap because between specification and implementation, as we all know, there is usually a gap, but also that gap evolves every day because we don't keep up with the specification. But at the same time, we update the product, we update the features, etc. And the reality is that it's just impossible to do that job manually. There is no way to do it. Here, you have to deal with the past, but you also have to deal with everything that is put together every day, and they can't do that job. So what they decided is to hire a privacy engineer. And the job of the privacy engineer is to build automation, digging into the code base, and finding a way to build more automation regarding that manual process, so you don't end up spending hundreds of hours interviewing people every day and basically chasing people to understand who is doing what and how. So it doesn't work. You can't keep up this way. And that's one of the main problems today with privacy, but data risk assessment in general. It's difficult to understand what's going on. So we think there is obviously a better way to do it, and there is overall a way that we've discussed with a lot of people in the industry. We call it the better way, but honestly, this is the way that I think most of the companies that are at the forefront are actually looking at. Is first, you have to identify your engineering assets. That's the first thing that you have to do. If you don't know how your softwares are built, what is your architecture look like, well, there is no way you're going to do anything. So you do that to have the visibility of that architecture. And the question is, how do you do it? Well, you build a catalog. It's all about having a catalog of all your assets, and your assets, your components. They're going to be your repositories, your database, your third-party APIs, your internal APIs, basically every tech component that is storing data or where data can flow into. Then you have some tools to help you. The first one, and the one that we see the most in the industry, is Google Spreadsheet. No big surprise here. The reality is that it's okay for like small team, but it doesn't scale obviously at all, though it's heavily used. You have also dedicated asset or catalog system like Backstage, which is an open source software built at Spotify, if I'm not mistaken. You've got also Jira Insight, which is an asset catalog system. And we've seen in the industry also different practice where companies ask their developers to annotate their code base with special comments, for instance. So whenever they were adding a new component, a new asset, they were actually building up a certain type of annotation. So then they could automate at the end the collection of that information. The issue here is that obviously it's difficult to do that once you've already built a lot of things. You don't want to go back to your code base, and you have to make your developers follow the process. At Burr, we do it differently with static analysis, and I will quickly talk about it after. But this is where we think there is really something to do with looking at what developer build and looking at the single source of truth, which is the code, where you have everything basically. The difficulty is to find what you want basically. Once you've got your assets, your catalog of all assets, then you can actually start to map your personal data flow, your critical data flow. Personal data flow in the case of privacy, but in the case of data security in general, every data that is sensitive for a company. So you do that because you need to understand how your product processes personal data from a privacy standpoint. How you do it, you enrich your inventory. That's why the inventory is critical, and you're going for each of those components, get the information and store the information, or does it process the personal data? Which type of personal data? And you're going to document that process. You can do it again with different software. You can do it manually with Jira workflow. OneTrust has like a survey feature. This is the example of the customer that I was talking. They were using a OneTrust survey feature for that. This is since OneTrust is heavily used in the industry. A lot of privacy teams use OneTrust and use that feature to ask engineering team, product team, all those information. This is where it's difficult to make it work at scale again. You've got also solutions that look into your databases and that are going to assess which type of data and personal data you have in your databases. There is one tool that is open source. That's why I wanted to mention it, which is PI Catcher, which has been built by the company Token, which help you find some patterns directly in your code in your database and help you put together that in an inventory. It's only for databases and it needs access to your database, which is potentially a risk or not enough. And you have again the code. You can look into the code base and you can look at pattern of usage of data and personal data in your code base. If you believe again that your source code is the single source of truth, this is where you're going to find anything that it's a database at the end or an internal API or third-party API, you're going to find all the flow of information in your code base. So once you've got that inventory, you can start to actually audit your controls from privacy and security standpoint. You do that because you want to identify the risk. So once again, it's all about risk management. So how you do it? Again, you enrich your inventory because, well, there are documentation that you need to provide from privacy or security. For example, which data subject is it about? What's the lawful basis? What's your data retention policy? How do you secure that specific data? Do you have a DPA with that third-party vendor that is providing you an API, for instance? All those kind of information that you have to fulfill once you know that you have personal data in one of the systems. And you start to be able to identify the gaps. So you put together your inventory next to your policy, to your data policy. They come from GDPR or whatever privacy law, and they come from your security team and your security requirements. And then you map those two together and you find the gaps. And when you look at the gaps, you're going to identify a few things. For example, you might identify that you're collecting more information than what your privacy policy is actually mentioning, that you might access like an excessive amount of personal data that you don't actually use. Potentially, you have a new third-party vendor, like a third-party API, for instance, that you're using, but you haven't documented it and you don't have a contract and a DPA in place that really mention the type of data you're sending them. Maybe you're storing some data way longer than what your policy is telling, etc. That's all those policies that you're going to try to find a gap into by mapping it to that inventory. And finally, well, what you have to do is you have to do that all the time. And that's where it's becoming extremely difficult. If you've been able to do the 1, 2, and 3, then you have to do that every day, basically. You have to do it every day because the risk is not obviously going to disappear. Actually, the risk is always here and is always building up. So you have to be proactive. You have to detect everything as soon as you can. And as soon as you can, it's why being embedded into directly the code base and being embedded directly into the software development lifecycle is interesting because you can actually catch things before anything bad happens or even before it's put in production. How you do it? Well, you just automate. I'm sorry, but I don't have any better way to do it. And if you don't automate, you can't do it. It's just impossible. We've never seen any companies being able to do that without automation. And this is where you start to enter into the privacy by design practices, where ideally, every time you've got your engineers committing new code, you're going to update your inventory. You're going to trigger a risk assessment workflow if there is a new type of data, a new type of component processing data, personal data that is detected. And you're going to raise a privacy alert to your privacy team if there is a gap that has been identified. If you don't do that automatically, you end up doing that once every quarter, once every year, and you end up in the situation of the customer that I was mentioning just before, with a very small fraction of the information actually collected, because just collecting the information is very, very difficult. So it's all about empowering privacy engineers when you think about it. And this is what we try to do at Bear and how we started that journey. And just in a nutshell, in like 30 seconds, what we do is we help security team, because our customers and our especially security team at tech companies, only tech companies, identify all their data security and privacy risk, because those two are highly connected. And I don't think you can do one without doing the other in reality. And we do that by scanning the code base. So we do static analysis and we plug machine learning on top of it. So we can catalog all components, we can catalog all the personal data, we can map those two, and we can trigger risk assessment workflow. So we can identify the gap in real time, directly plugged in the code base, without asking people to change their way of doing things, without connecting to their production database. And this is for us very important because you don't want to ask your team to change their habits. It's very difficult. You don't want to be like a security liability either. So this is why we've taken this way, and we're working today with like a dozen quite big tech company, unicorn company, as design partner. And this is something that you feel like, well, it rings a bell and it's interesting, and I'd like to see it live. Don't hesitate to drop me an email. More than happy to give a demo and discuss what you've been doing, what works, what doesn't work. We always try to understand from the industry what are the best practices and try to embed all of that into a tool that can empower the privacy engineers, and at the end of the day, just empower organizations to be better on privacy and to put privacy at the forefront of whatever they're doing. Any questions?
Hi, thank you very much, Guillaume. It was very interesting. And yes, we have some questions from the chat, and 3 minutes to answer it. So that's perfect. We have Mossab. Mossab say that so privacy laws are emerging, and today in lots of companies, it's data security tools and frameworks that protect data. And so he asked, should we change the mindset by giving users control over the data to protect data instead of letting that to security framework to assess the risk of having data privacy issue?
Well, you always have to protect data. Like that's why, like, data security, data privacy, at the end of the day, it's very close, and it has to be close, because there are like 3 things that you want to avoid as a company. You want to avoid privacy leaks. You want to avoid data leaks. You want to avoid data breaches, and you want to avoid privacy violation. If you put privacy violation aside, at the end of the day, as a company, you're going to own customer data. Companies are having my data, and I just want to make sure that when I give them my data, yes, I want to be able to give them whatever I want, and that's probably what Apple is trying to do most of the time. But at the end of the day, when I give them something, because I need to give them something, otherwise it's difficult to get access to a product, I want to make sure that they are going to do everything possible to limit the risk and limit the impact of them getting breached, of them getting leaked, even besides privacy itself. So that's why, like, putting it as a risk assessment framework for security team makes a lot of sense, especially for tech companies, because security team already exists. Their job is already to do risk assessment. Usually they secure system, but the reality is, like, securing system, it's difficult when your systems are so big and so complex. And what makes a system important and a system where you want to be very careful, it's the data that system is holding. So that's why, like, data security is just the extension of what we do in security. It's just like going deeper and having an X-ray in all your system, because at the end, you just want to make sure that you're not going to get breached, you're not going to get leaked. You've seen Twitch that has been breached a few weeks ago. Everything is out. Their code source, their model of revenue, how much they compensated every broadcaster, etc. So it's awful for a company. Even if you put privacy aside, you just don't want your data, yours, mine, out in the wild just because I gave them and I decided to give them to that company for good reasons, but they didn't succeed at protecting it.
Okay. Maybe a last question. We have 30 seconds. So listening to your presentation, you said that lots of DPOs use like old techniques like spreadsheets, Word to map the data and say what we can do or not do with this data. And you presented solutions like tokens, like Jira, etc., to resolve this problem. Do you think solutions today are enough, or is there, I mean, to have a good privacy level to manage data, or do you think there is a gap in the market and we need new tools to assess that?
So well, clearly we need new tools, otherwise we wouldn't have started Bear as a company, and we believe there is clearly a very big gap, especially for tech companies, because the information is so deep down, is so hidden, so that you have to resurface it, and you can't do that manually. You can't manually analyze hundreds of millions of lines of code. Only a machine can do that. Though on top of it, you have a lot of things to do, and some of those things are actually well taken care of by existing product in the industry. I think everything that is very legal centric regarding privacy, there are a lot of tools there. But the reality is that those tools are useless if you don't have the data. And gathering the data is one of the biggest difficulty today, making it, like evergreen, having always those information, having the maximum information, having those in real time almost, but at least not once every year, I would say, without spending hours interviewing people. So there are I think it's missing some tools, especially for some companies. I guess every company is going to become a tech company at some point, or going to be replaced by one. So there is clearly investment to do there. But besides tooling, because tooling is super important, but you also need to have the mindset, you need to have the education. And I think this is where also it's lacking. And it's interesting when you look at engineers, you would say well, they don't care about that. No, the reality is that engineers, developers, they're the first one to take care about their own privacy. So they should be the one listening and understanding. And the issue with privacy in general, it's different with security, but with privacy, is that it's so much tied to the legal aspect, and you never understand what can I do. And I, as a developer, as an engineer, tell me what I have to do, basically. And when you talk about GDPR, when you talk about privacy from that lens, it's always blurry. You just forget about it, and you just don't want to hear about it. You need pragmatic tools. You need an education regarding it, and that's what's going to help. It's obviously not only tooling. Tooling is an important part of the equation, and especially the one that I mentioned before.
Thank you very much.